Good evening, everybody. Hi. Nice to see everybody again. Today we're going to be talking about eclipses and how they can fit in. There's a couple of eclipses coming, so you can find them on your chart. Now, I am not an expert on eclipses by any means at all, but Marcos is very, very knowledgeable about them. And so I shall be asking him a few questions about eclipses and how they can affect the chart medically, which is very relevant, obviously, to the upcoming ones, and you can see if they're going to affect you and things you should know about them. So, Marcus, first of all, I think you'd like to just read a little bit from the Tetrabiblia, so what the ancients say about this.
Yeah. So I mean, just to start with, I mean, what we'll be talking about this episode are the upcoming eclipses as we're filming this, but everything we'll talk about in the next half hour is applicable to eclipses in general. We'll
Yeah,
just be using the upcoming ones as examples, and we're
absolutely.
not going to be able to cover everything because it's just a half-hour episode, but we'll just touch on some of the medical relevance. So yeah, Tetrabiblos that you've just mentioned. This is Ptolemy's book, Claudius Ptolemy, written about third century, and I think it's the best text on traditional interpretation of eclipses. And it's really only like three chapters, I think. There's chapter 7 of, I don't know which is third book or one of the books anyway. There's chapter 7 of one of the books in here. But there's only about three chapters in it, but it's worth getting the translation of this just for those three chapters. And he mainly focuses on the sort of mundane use of eclipses, which means the effect of eclipses on international events. But you can extrapolate this and use it for medical astrology on a personal level, which we'll talk about. So, a few things just preliminary. He differentiates between solar and lunar eclipses, and we've got eclipses always happen in pairs because tend to because just as the new moon is succeeded about 2 weeks later by the full moon, and usually they are in a similar alignment with respect to the lining up of the plane of the Earth's orbit around the sun and the moon's orbit around the Earth, which is what causes eclipses, of course, when they sort of all line up in front of each other in a row. That just means they happen in pairs. So usually you get an eclipse season twice a year. So we're entering into one this March in 2024. So what Ptolemy says about the solar eclipses, lunar eclipses, but eclipses universally are disruptive. They're always thought to cause some kind of disruption. Ptolemy says that the solar eclipses tend to have longer effect duration, and lunar eclipses shorter. He only counts eclipses as having effect on world events in a particular location when the eclipse occurs above the horizon, when it is technically visible from wherever you are in the world. Now, of course, I'm saying technically because there might be cloud cover, you might not see it, but if it's above the horizon, he says it could affect where you are. That is not to say, though, and this is not in Ptolemy, but we'll make it clear, if an eclipse falls on a sensitive point in your birth chart or the chart of a person or a country or something like that, it can absolutely have an effect. So I think Ptolemy was just saying in terms of events happening in the world right now, just globally, on mundane level, it has to be visible above the horizon. But if that eclipse fell on, say, the ascendant of a country where it wasn't visible, it would still be expected to have some effect on that country if you know
So,
the birth chart of the country.
Marcus, would this be a bit like accidental dignity? That obviously, if in theory you could see the eclipse, it's very strong in itself, but obviously it's going to affect everybody, but maybe not to the same extent. But obviously, if it lines up with various planets, you're going to see something or feel something.
Yes, and Ptolemy has some very it is, but Ptolemy had some very specific rules for this as well.
Okay. Hmm.
In brief, if the eclipse happens near the eastern horizon, the events signified by it will begin almost immediately, or he says within the first 4 months. If the
Okay.
eclipse happens near the midheaven, the events will happen in the middle 4 months, or if it's actually on the MC right in the middle of the sky in 6 months' time. And if the eclipse happens near a sunset when on the western horizon, or it could be a full moon, of course, or moon set. If the eclipse happens near the descendant, near the western horizon, then the events will only really begin to unfold in a year. And I think this is a point of incredible nuance that's missing from most of the internet commentary I see on eclipses, which is that the effects of the eclipse when we're predicting on an international scale are not to be expected to happen immediately. They are often only begin, like say it happens in a particular location, you've got an eclipse in the sky, but it's happening near the western horizon. The effects signified by that eclipse, the events may only begin in a year's time. And then he says the duration of those events will last as long if it's a solar eclipse in years, and if it's a lunar eclipse in months, as the eclipse lasts in hours. So it's sort of like he translates that into duration. And then he also says that where the eclipse happens in the sky will tell you when the most significant effects will be felt in that time frame. So say you have an eclipse that lasts, I don't know, I think he says like lasts an hour, so the effects might last a year if it's a solar eclipse. I mean, he's talking about not the total eclipse is usually very brief. You're not going to get a total eclipse that lasts an hour, but like I think it's the time it takes to traverse the entire disk of the sun. So say you get something that might last an hour, and I haven't had time to revise this, so if I make any mistakes, it's not on Ptolemy, it's on me. But anyway, so if it lasts an hour, the effects might last for a year. If it's on the western horizon, the effects will begin in about a year from the time of the eclipse, will last a year, but then they'll happen right at the end. The main effects will happen right at the end of that year. So the chief effects will happen, as far away as possible. So 2 years hence. If the eclipse lasts an hour in total, the effects will last a year if it's a solar eclipse. But if it happens in the middle of the sky, the most intense portion of that effect will be in the middle of that year. So the chief effect will be in a year and a half. Do you follow?
So it's almost as if like the timing of it is that, and this is quite a good model, I suppose, for international events and illness. It's something is started by the eclipse, if you like to put it that way, but we're not going to necessarily see it like, an illness might start, but you don't think anything of it.
100%. So the eclipse is often an initiation point. It's like an opening of the doors where something comes through, and there will be something that happens around the time of an eclipse, but the chiefest consequences or the emergence of the main effects may not happen until then. So the difference here is that if the eclipse is falling on a very significant point in your birth chart or in someone else's chart, then you'll often get the thing happening at the time of the eclipse if it's triggering something in your chart. But you may also find, if the eclipse is visible where you are in the world, that the consequences of that disruption that happened to you at the time of the eclipse will unfold following that sort of main predicted timing. And then something
Marcus, what you mentioned there about it affects sort of what sort of sort of orb are you giving? Would you say, would you like an eclipse to be of a significant
oh, you mean if it's on your chart or something? I usually want it within a couple of degrees to be.
And would there have to be a conjunction, or could it be by aspect?
Conjunction is most powerful, opposition secondly, and then squares.
Right, okay.
Squares are going to do something.
But if it was like a perfected square, you might be a bit more worried than if it was 3 degrees out.
Conjunction is by far the most significant, and then opposition, and then squares to some degree. I wouldn't really worry about trines and sextiles and stuff like that. And eclipse is often, so I'll stick with Ptolemy, and then we'll have a look at the charts, and then I'll give you some of my thoughts on it and on what we can see.
Excellent.
So what else did Ptolemy say? He goes on. I mean, it's worth reading. As I say, it's Tetrabiblos. It's chapters 8, 9. He talks about how you can interpret the eclipse and see what kind of things are affected in the world. Is it animals or people, or fishes or cattle or whatever it is. And then he goes on to say how you can analyze the eclipse, the quality and nature of the effect. And this often comes down to the governing planet of the eclipse. That's like whatever sign it's in, is the ruler of that sign will tell you something about the nature. But there is a nuance here, but again, we only have a short podcast, so we don't want to turn this into a 3-hour class. So the nuance here is that he would also look at the angle in the chart closest to where the eclipse is. And if the same planet was ruling both the angles, that's definitely the ruler. If the ruler of the sign where the eclipse is kind of weak in the chart, but the ruler of the previous angle is strong, then you might prefer that planet. And so he gives a bunch of rules. But the TLDR, the short version is, you can probably always look at the ruler of the sign the eclipse is in to see to some degree what it'll be affecting. And we're going to focus on the two naughty planets, not because we don't like the other planets, but because they are the most relevant for medical issues,
Absolutely,
because
yeah.
they're the most productive of medical problems. So he talks about when Saturn is the governor, the sole governor, will produce disasters concomitant with cold, and diseases. He talks amongst men, lingering diseases, consumptions, declines, rheumatism, disorders from watery humors, and attacks of the quartan ague, which is sort of like the aches in the bones and that sort of thing. I think it was the name of a type of malarial fever that used to be around, but it's sort of like diseases of old age, or diseases that affect the elderly more, and diseases that linger. And interestingly, the eclipse that preceded the international spread of coronavirus, or shall we rephrase that, because it's now thought that the coronavirus may have begun to spread internationally before 2020. So that preceded the global awareness of the spread of COVID from Wuhan, the eclipse that happened in Beijing or over Wuhan, similarly, was an eclipse ruled by Saturn. It was the and so diseases it affected old people mostly, yada yada. And then you've got Mars. Mars, when governing alone, diseases concomitant with dryness. Talks about foreign wars, intestine divisions, which sounds delightful. And then in terms of diseases, feverish disorders, tertian agues, and hemorrhages, and rapidly followed by painful death, carrying off chiefly youthful persons, and conflagration. So the interesting thing is here, Saturn will tend to affect the elderly more, and Mars will tend to affect the youth, in the same way that starvation or deprivation will often kill the weaker members of society, but wars will often kill the young and vital because they get recruited and whatever. So it's a similar.
And of course, certain flu. I mean, because as I recall, the Spanish flu was particularly deadly to young people,
Yes,
wasn't it?
exactly. So that's a perfect example, Ollie, because something like the eclipse that preceded the international awareness of the spread of COVID was a Saturn ruled eclipse. Saturn in Aquarius, incidentally conjunct Pluto from modern astrological law. But then you've got I haven't checked out the Spanish flu one, but I would not be at all surprised to see if an eclipse preceding the emergence of the Spanish flu, which was absolutely devastating, was more Mars ruled. Or possibly even Mars and Saturn, because it killed so many people. So anyway, I mean, he says a lot more, but I don't want to go. So let's have a look at two eclipse charts. There are some thoughts that I've had that I'm not yet absolutely solid on, but I think are worth thinking about. Ptolemy only counts the eclipses above the horizon because he says they'll produce effects in the future. A little thought that I've been playing with, and I think seems to be accurate, is that when an eclipse happens below the horizon, I think what it represents to me is events that have already happened in the past and come to full emergence at the time of the eclipse. Right. So, and that is the reason behind what even made me think that in the first place is because it's this original metaphysics of the houses, the creation of this symbolic division of the sky into houses, which of course isn't real. The sky isn't really sliced into 12 segments like a cake. It's just like a way of dividing. The above ground was seen as, life above ground. And then what was below ground traditionally was the underworld, which is why the setting place of the sun, the western horizon, was one of the other places of death in many ancient predictive systems. So the point is, if it's in the underworld, it's stuff that's happened in the past. It's nearer the roots, it's the foundations. Then it emerges into life at the ascendant. Whereas if it's something that's happening above the ascendant, it's something that's already in the world and is going to be bearing fruit. So I mean, I've played with that, and that does seem to be relevant. So if following Ptolemy's rules, if there was an eclipse in the sky in a place, if there was an eclipse at any time in a place in the world where you couldn't see it, it may produce no effect at all. However, if that eclipse fell on a significant place in somebody's chart or in the chart of the country, then it would produce an effect, which we'll talk about in a moment, depending on what it falls on in the chart. But you could try looking at, if it's below the horizon in the part of the world, look at where it is below the horizon. The closer to the ascendant it is, the more recent the triggering events may have been. The closer to the descendant it is, the further away. Like if it's in the sixth house, the eclipse falls in the sixth house where you are, then maybe the triggering events were up to a year away. And I played with that, and that seems to work. So that is a little innovation of mine that you might want to experimentate with, but it's based on the same principles as what Ptolemy uses. Anyway, right.
Oh, to the examples.
Yes. Not before time. So let's look at the, as we speak, lunar eclipse upcoming. And I've set these eclipses for London, but again, the principles can be used. So you can see this is a lunar eclipse, so it's a full moon. And you can tell, for those who aren't well versed in astrology, that this is an eclipse because you can see that the sun and moon are close to these little horseshoe shaped things, which are called the nodes, which are really eclipse points. That's what they are. They mark the intersection of the plane of the Earth's orbit around the sun and the moon's orbit around the Earth. So in other words, when the sun and moon are on these points at the same time, there will be an eclipse. So you see the sun's at 23 Pisces, fairly close to the node at 27 Pisces. That's the north node. And then that's the horseshoe pointing up, or the little cloche shaped thing here. And then at the other end, you've got the moon at 2356 Virgo, close to the south node. Now, this is a distinction that Ptolemy doesn't particularly harp on, but I think is highly relevant. This is a lunar eclipse because it's a full moon, which means that the shadow of the Earth is being projected onto the moon by the sun. So it is the moon that is getting eclipsed. So the disruption is happening at the moon end of things. The reason this is significant, I think, is because the sun in medical astrology is the heart, the source of vitality, life, the battery, and the moon represents the body. The moon is the mirror that reflects the light of the sun to the earth, in the same way that the body is the vessel that contains the spark of life. This is the metaphysics that we're looking at. So when you get a disruption of the moon, it'll tend to affect the body quite significantly. If you get a disruption of the sun, it will affect the life force. So in other words, a disruption of either luminary like this, the light getting cut off, represents life disrupting phenomena. Now, the south node is a point of exit or leaving. So often when you get an eclipse on the south node, there's a disruption and then something is gone or something goes from your life. Now, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing is extremely case dependent. It's going to depend what's gone on, what that eclipse is falling on, etc. It's a bit like, the analogy I use is, an eclipse is like your computer suddenly crashes, and then when you reboot it, if it's a south node eclipse, something's missing. That missing thing could be a crucial file or the thing that makes your computer work, or it could be a virus or some problem that you've been trying to get rid of for ages. Likewise, with a solar eclipse, your computer crash, or a north node eclipse, the opposite. So if the eclipse, and we'll look at a north node eclipse next. So this is a south node lunar eclipse. So the moon in Virgo is going to be showing something that's disappearing. So we can look at what the sign Virgo, it's ruled by Mercury. So Mercury is a planet that's to do with technology, things to do with people, books, civilization, etc. In medical terms, though, we're looking at a disruption with the moon and Virgo. And for this, you have to know a bit medical astrology. The moon rules many different parts of the body: brain, bowels, bladder, intestines, eyes, lymphatic system. Virgo, though, specifically rules the small intestine, the gallbladder, probably the pancreas and the spleen. So the overlap between those two is that the moon and Virgo both rule the small intestine. So on an individual level, people might get a few gut problems potentially. Like, that's just a really simple way of looking at it. Often, though, more specifically, it will depend if somebody has something in their chart at that sort of late, sort of the last 10 degrees of Virgo or the last 10 degrees of Pisces. And if you do, there may, around the time of the eclipse, be some kind of disruption. What makes this eclipse extra juicy is that we can see Saturn is there at 22 Pisces, conjunct the sun and opposing the moon. So it's going to that's going to introduce themes of coldness, obstruction, blockages, um, issues. So if I were to interpret this psychologically, this might be a sort of a disruption to something like, say, the moon is a nurse, like trying to, in Virgo, like Virgo is all about service very often. The moon's a nurse trying to provide services, and maybe there's an illness that goes around the hospital and they have to shut the hospital for a few days. It's something like that. There's some disruption to service that's going on here. And if it falls on a particular place in your chart, it may cause some health issue temporarily that's associated with that part of the body, wherever it's falling in the chart.
And Marcus, and you say
Yeah.
temporarily because this is the moon, and that's not going to last as long as the sun, sort of thing.
Well,
Or
I mean, it's mostly going to be temporarily because most things aren't permanent. But I mean, we've all
true,
got to die
true.
sometimes, so there might be somebody who does. But it's the bottom line is, for most people and most things, it will be a temporary thing.
Right,
It's going to be a temporary glitch. And I don't want to. Eclipses can sometimes bring in, like a south node eclipse like this could remove something that's a major problem in your life. And
right,
because this is an eclipse opposed to Saturn, it might do so in an ungentle way. It might be like suddenly there's some kind of crisis where you can't get access to some resource, or something's shut off and it's massively stressful and things aren't working. And then afterwards, as a result of that disruption, you've cleared out some block or removed some issue that
right,
was,
right. Yes,
so say this eclipse is falling on a difficult planet in your chart. Then it might cause a temporary disruption of function, and that might be physical in terms of health, or it might be in terms of something else that that planet represents in your chart. But
right.
the end result of a south node eclipse is always some kind of removal, and that removal, you can, and the reason I can't be more specific than that is because you first of all need the chart of the individual or situation that you're looking at. And by the way, this is why people often, a complaint that's often leveled at astrologers is, well, if you're so good, why didn't you predict 9/11 or stuff like that? Well, I mean, first of all, there was an astrologer called Robert Zoller who sort of did. He moved out of New York ahead of time. But you have to be very, very, very lucky to do that sort of thing, because you need to be looking at the chart of the thing in order to read it in that way. Number one. And number two, astrology, like all divination, is totally context dependent. So on an individual level, if you're somebody who has planets in that last 10 degrees of Virgo or Pisces, you've been having some health problems or health niggles, then just around the middle of this month, 14th March, then just be a bit more vigilant. And if something does get disrupted, then don't wait on it. And yeah, I mean, that's as much as I can say about that without knowing specific circumstances. But it is just as likely that the end result can be quite positive. Eclipses disrupt, but the end result of disruption is not always negative. But anyway, this Virgo one might be some kind of disruption of service. If we're being really specifically anatomical, it could be small intestine, because we're moon and Virgo. The moon in Virgo, it's also, the moon is the third sign from the sign Cancer. So that is sometimes taken to be analogous to the third sign of the zodiac, Gemini. So the
But
moon in Virgo.
Marcus,
Yeah.
presumably it could also refer to whatever planet is being conjuncted or opposed by it. So,
Yes, yes. Yeah,
if
yeah.
it was like, I don't know, Mercury or something, it could be something happening with the arms or hand or the nervous system or whatever sort of thing.
Yes, and yeah, exactly. Now, that's interesting about that is the moon in Virgo represents Gemini, which could be arms, shoulders, hands. And exactly as you're pointing out, Ollie, the ruler of this moon is Mercury, which can rule the arms, shoulders, or hands. And Mercury's in Aries, so it could represent things to do with the head. Mercury is also in the eighth sign from, I think, one of its signs. is it in the eighth sign from one of its signs? Yeah,
Hang
it's the
on.
eighth sign from Gemini, I think. So
Yes,
no,
yes,
from Virgo, beg pardon, the
yes.
eighth sign from Virgo. So that could be the bowels, or there's lots of different possibilities.
There's lots of
The,
difference. So
the,
that's the thing. So it really is personal to one's own chart, which is almost
Yes, and,
really
and
not
and to the one
generalized.
circumstance, but you could look at some kind of physical health disruption that may be due to cold or obstruction or blockage or exhaustion, that opposition to Saturn just being
Yes.
ground down, by all of that. And then it may show up in that mercurial way as well. So like nervous system, maybe stuff in the head, like dizziness, vertigo, tinnitus, or maybe wind in the bowel, lots of different possibilities according to circumstance. But the point is, around the middle of the month, if you've got planets in those places, just take care a little bit more and look out for yourself. And
Perfect.
the
So
point is, the aftermath of this can potentially just as easily remove a problem from your life. People often get, particularly obviously, we're medical astrologers, so we'll focus on the negative potentials because that's what we're looking for. Where are the potential problems here? But so say this eclipse fell on, I don't know, your natal Saturn or something. Worst case scenario, medically, there might be a temporary intestinal obstruction, or you might get really constipated or something like that. Then as a result of that medical crisis, that issue gets resolved, and you never have to deal with it again, and it's actually caused things to come to a head.
yeah,
And
it's
as
gone.
eclipses can work like that. So let's have a
So
look at the second one, which
I
is
was
a
about to
solar.
say, yeah, let's have a look at the solar one. So that'd be
Yes.
interesting.
So these eclipses are particularly exciting for you and I, Ollie, because as we noted before filming, the lunar eclipse is falling on something pretty major in your chart, and the
It
solar
is.
eclipse is falling on something pretty major in my chart. So we've got some fun times to look forward to.
Absolutely,
Um,
yes.
yeah. So what's interesting about the previous eclipse, we noticed it was ruled by Mercury but opposed by Saturn. Well, this eclipse you can see is a solar eclipse happening in Aries and 9 degrees Aries. And as you can see, again, I've cast this for London. Using Ptolemy's rules, the effects of this eclipse may not be fully manifest for about 5 months or so. He says the eclipse was right on the midheaven, it'd be about 6 months. I reckon it's
Right.
about five
Yeah.
months.
Yeah.
So the effect of this eclipse may only fully begin in August, but something may well happen at the time of the eclipse, particularly if it's falling on something significant in your chart, which it is in mine. So I'll be looking out for what happens at the end of this month. Is there something that's happening
Yeah.
there? And what's interesting about this one is it's falling in Aries, so it's ruled by Mars. So the previous eclipse was opposed by Saturn. This one is ruled by Mars.
I'm
So if
Mars.
we
Right.
yeah, so if we were going to use Ptolemy's criteria, we might be thinking here of things like, medically speaking, sort of fevers and infections and injuries and sudden events. Whereas the previous eclipse, the lunar eclipse, they could be sudden, but it's more likely to be obstructions or like issues due to fatigue or whatever. This is more likely accidental injury or very sudden events, that kind
Yeah.
of thing. So I mean, Ptolemy does give more specifics, but so again, if this eclipse is not so exact as the previous eclipse, you can see how total an eclipse is by how close it is to the node. And you can see we've got the north node here at 27 Pisces. The sun and moon, this new moon, is happening at 9 Aries. So that's 10, 11, 12. That's nearly 12 degrees away from the node or whatever. So this is only going to be a partial eclipse. It's still an eclipse, but it's not going to be a total solar eclipse. It's partial because it's a bit further away from that eclipse point. It's still within range, but it's partial. So it's not super, super powerful, unless, as I say, it's hitting something in your chart, in which case it might well be. So what else to say about it from a traditional point? Oh, yeah, it's a north node eclipse. So this one's a north node. So this is likely to bring something in. So whereas the previous one, disruption afterwards, when the dust settles, something has gone. With this one, when the dust settles, something has come in. And again, it's going to really depend on what it's hitting in your chart and how it interacts with your chart.
Yeah.
I have a feeling, even though this eclipse is ruled by a dodgy Mars in Cancer, I am hopeful that for myself, the end result of it might be moderately positive because I'm natal Mars in Cancer. And born at night, so that Mars is slightly less unfriendly to me, and it is my chart ruler. And Venus at the time of this eclipse at 28 Pisces is in trine to my natal Mars. So it's kind of like there's a little supportive influence or two. But yeah, I mean, in terms of what one might globally expect, there might be some sort of feverish illnesses or some sudden events. But this chart over London doesn't tell of the emergence of any new superbug or anything, because you would be looking at the sixth house of illness in a chart
Yeah.
for a particular location, and that is ruled by a fantastically weak Jupiter and Gemini in the 12th house. So we're not looking at the emergence of any new viral thing here. But it might be somewhat disruptive, I think, to the people of the country, perhaps through issues to do with government or children in some way, or money from property, because that Mars rules the fifth house and the 10th. But in terms of health, as I say, Mars ruled eclipse, so maybe inflammation, and you just see if it falls on anything significant in your
Yeah, because
chart.
isn't the fifth house a house of speculation as well?
That's true.
So it could be
Yeah.
a small stock market collapse or something like that would be very relevant
Yes.
sort of
Well,
thing.
what's interesting here is that this eclipse is ultimately ruled by Mars and the Moon. Everything in this chart is ruled by Mars and the Moon. And the thing here is that this is technically, the Moon on an eclipse is Cazimi. The Moon is in the heart of the Sun. The Moon is
Right, of course,
actually
yes.
covering up the Sun. So her own light is being cut off because she is a borrowed light. Her light isn't
Yeah.
nicked from the Sun, but it's still like that. So what the Moon is in this chart, the ascendant ruler. So it represents the people of the country, and as you say, Mars, because it rules the fifth house of speculation, and it falls in the 10th. So there's something to do, to my mind, with dodgy dealings of leaders, and maybe leaders or important people having some sort of public comeuppance or something like
Coming
that.
unstuck. Well, be that not before time, so we'll see.
Well, and that may only emerge in sort of August or
Bit
something like
later.
that.
So yeah, they might make their mistake now, and yeah, we'll see.
Yeah, yeah. So we shall see. And traditionally, the Sun ruled boss men or monarchs, kings and queens. Actually, the
Yes.
Moon was more queen, but Sun is boss people. So we'll see. But anyway, that was a very, very short serial box episode on eclipses, and we touched on the medical uses of them. I think what we'll do in some future episode, it'll take a bit of prep, so we'll have to organize ourselves. But what we might do is I might see if we could get a guest on who's willing to, like, somebody. We could maybe each do this at some point, where we see if we can get a former client on for whom we've done some astrological work,
That'd be interesting,
and
yes.
sort of interview them, and talk to them about what they experienced and so on. So I think that would be
A good idea, yes.
useful.
Okay, definitely.
Anyway, right, thank you for being the more sort of backseat question asking element of
I've
this.
learned a great deal, Marcos. So I should be rushing to my chart now and checking it out, and like thinking, I've got to wrap myself in cotton wool for the rest of the month.
Well, I don't generally recommend that approach, wrapping oneself in cotton wool. I think it is interesting because it's sort of, with eclipses, they say that these events are quote unquote fated, meaning that it's stuff that's gonna happen, whatever. And I guess I can see that's true. They're often surprising, but I haven't found that they're as surprising as, I don't know, like Uranus aspect or something.
I've got a pretty good idea of the vulnerable points of my body, particularly as aspected by this. And it's like, okay, I take some herbs. I'll be careful what I eat and what I do, etc., etc. And let's see if we can get through this.
And what might happen is, if you're fully physically buffered, whatever the eclipse represents will pop up somewhere else, like in your life, like through this happening to them, or that issue. Do you know what I mean? Who knows whether that's active displacement that's happening, or whether it's simply that would have happened anyway. But, I mean, therein lie the mysteries of astrology.
Absolutely.
You can sometimes see exactly what's going to happen if only you knew exactly what was going to happen. Do you know what I mean? It's like, I know when, I know what sort of thing, I know what it'll feel like, and I can sort of even say in what part of my life it'll show up, but until it actually happens. But Yeah, it's just it's interesting, and the value of it, I think, from a treatment point of view, is because you know the astrology, you kind of get a sense of timing, duration, what it represents, and having that in your mind can often give
Exactly.
you a handle on how to deal with it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Anyway,
Absolutely.
right.
Well,
Thanks,
thank you
Ollie.
very much, Marcos. That was fascinating. And
Thank you.
till next time. Bye bye.
Amazing.
And bye bye,
Thanks, Ollie.
everyone
Thanks,
else.
guys.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.